Hi, Professor. Thanks for that. That was fantastic. So I recently read your paper on social networks and agricultural technology adoption, and it got me thinking about all the different sorts of implications that that has. And in fact, there's a body of literature that you talked about briefly, and you talked about the policy implications for the government. What are the implications for the private sector? How can the private sector use the insights from this body of literature to help technology adoption?
Okay, I think there's a couple of possible answers to that. Number one is these value chains that we've talked about before. There's particularly for export crops, there's I don't know if it's growing. It's been there for a long time, but I think it's becoming more important. System of contract farming, where if you're trying to export flowers from Kenya, pineapple from Ghana, tomatoes from Burkina Faso, you need to make sure that supplies are reliable. You need to make sure that there are that the quality is correct. Oh, supermarkets in South Africa are starting to do this too. And so it's important for these larger scale institutions to have farmers who understand what they're doing and to be a resource for farmers in order to enable farmers to meet their contractual obligations to them. And so I think that's perhaps the most, that's what's going on now. And so if you look at exporters of crops, they're working with farmers now, and they're working typically with farmer groups and trying to let farmers help each other out. And so rather than having the expense of contacting each farmer individually, you form farmers into a group, you take lead farmers, and then they diffuse knowledge within groups. So that's an old model that's being used commonly. Now, IT is the most obvious new model, and we've seen experiments with that. There's farmer books, electronic books with information being distributed in Nigeria and in Ghana and in Kenya. There's a system being experimented with in India now, but soon to be transferred to Kenya and Tanzania, in which there's a wiki when you're farming a certain thing, and you get a knowledge base developed by other farmers where you can ask questions and then get responded, and it has to be oral rather than written, so it's a little, apparently there's technical complications, I don't understand it. But so that you can see new technologies being able to move around the older model of farmer groups that are formally set up and with physical visits. On the other hand, there's something to be said for having an expert coming out to your farm and see it and talk with you. And so that personal connection is probably something that's going to remain important for a long time. And so somebody else, I can't remember who's talking about it, but farmer-based organizations is the standard way, becoming the standard way in which agricultural advice is now being provided. And so instead of having one-on-one conversations between extension agents and individual farmers, farmers are grouped together and expected to diffuse knowledge within the group. The problem is to give them incentives so that they all want to make sure each other are doing better. Yeah. Okay.
I'm curious as to why you never mentioned the concept of practice crop rotation. It strikes me that crop rotation would address a number of issues related to fallow land, both the economics of leaving it fallow as well as the tenure issue.
Yeah.
Is that simply, are there simply not alternatives available for crop rotation?
Okay, so people do use crop rotation in some farming systems, but most of the farming systems that I'm familiar with in Africa use within-year crop rotation. There's intercropping, where you're mixing crops with different demands on the soil and the land together at the same time. The fallowing system you can think of as, in fact, crop rotation. Right? It's the fallow isn't, in fact, you leaving the land entirely free. You manage it. You make sure that certain trees and bushes are growing, and you weed it continually, even while it's fallow. And so it's a bit it's a bit like a crop rotation system. Then a third type of crop rotation system, which is becoming more and more common, especially in northern Nigeria, is green manuring, where the crop rotation is really managed fallow in which nutrients are put back into the soil. And so, but the typical northern European and American crop rotation system of specific crops following each other annually doesn't seem to be profitable. And I actually don't have enough knowledge about the agronomics of it to understand why.
Yes, my name is Wenwa Akinyi. I'm a Kenya Consul General based in Los Angeles. You talk about the use of fertilizer being limited by cost, and yet most of these farmers have at least some animals, goats, cows. So I wonder, is it possible to use organic manure? Encourage them to produce some compost manure.
Right. Oh, thank you for that question. My current project is on organic manures. So the answer is this has been a bit of extension advice for decades to try to get farmers to move towards crop-livestock integration. Certain areas of Africa, it's fully integrated. In Ethiopia, in northern Nigeria, farmers fully integrate their crop and their livestock production. They use their animals for manure. They feed their animals on crop stubble. They use that. So farmers are willing to do that when it's profitable. In other areas, like the western Kenya area I'm familiar with, and most of West Africa, not Nigeria, farmers have been advised to do this for decades and won't do it. And I think the reason is that we haven't kept full account of the costs in terms of labor of fully integrating crops and livestock. So when you do that, you have to enclose your livestock, you have to bring food to your livestock, and then you have to take the manure from the pen out to your farms. And that's incredibly expensive in terms of labor. So we're trying to separate that a little bit. And it's now in many African countries, including both Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, organic compost is becoming commercially available. So farmers can start using that without enclosing their livestock. And so we're now experimenting with whether that more limited change is profitable. If it is, and they see that organic manure is having a long-term benefit to their soil fertility, then they may become more willing to start enclosing their animals and save on the cost of buying organic manure by producing it themselves. But it seems like the step from separated farming systems to full integration is just too big, and farmers aren't making it in most places in Africa.
I was just in Nepal, and I noticed that in Nepal, many fields, which are all non-mechanized, are the big mounds of manure.
Yes.
Just before, and I was there during the spring season, and I don't know why is it that it's done there, because their animals are not confined.
Okay. The same thing happens in northern Nigeria, actually. And so what you'll do is you'll have cattle coming and grazing on a farmer's field, and the farmer will be essentially exchanging the crop residue for the manure that the livestock are bringing in. This becomes profitable as land becomes scarce relative to labor. And so as land becomes more valuable, it becomes more valuable to invest in your land. You farm it more intensively. You start using organic manure. That's why we see it in Ethiopia. It must be in Rwanda, although I don't know, and Burundi. I don't actually know. That's why we see it in certain very densely populated areas, like around Kano in northern Nigeria. But we don't see it in the less densely populated areas. It's also true that in most of Kenya and in most of West Africa, farmers don't have that much livestock. So they don't generate that much manure. Yeah, they're goats and sheep.
We can take one more question. Over here.
Thank you. So my question is sort of around fertilizer. I mean, I understand the importance of, getting Africa to a higher production in agriculture, but at the same time, you look at the U.S. and, it's like you see, it's producing really high, but then you also have all these issues with the food and the pesticides and all those things that goes into our food that's really unhealthy for us. And now you have businesses, organic businesses, which really should have been the natural way of producing food in the first place. I mean, how do we deal with this in Africa and making sure that this is not a route that we're going to?
Right. So I think that organic agriculture is a great thing as a choice, but forced organic agriculture is a bad thing. And so where the product can be differentiated in the product chain and labeled as this is organic and we're willing to pay a premium for it, then that's fantastic. And so what the world I'm hoping for is one in which African consumers and African farmers can make that choice, where they can decide if you want relatively inexpensive food, it can be produced with fertilizer and maybe pesticides and monitored with an appropriate health system so that people know what they're getting. And people can pay more for organic produce that's produced and monitored in an organic way. But right now what we have is Africa's the leading continent on the world in organic agriculture. But they're doing it in a way that's sort of forced on the farmers. They don't have the chance to use this productivity enhancing inputs. And so this does make me very unpopular with most of my friends in liberal New Haven when I talk about the benefits of this, because the levels of use in Africa are so low that the environmental externalities are still second order. The environmental externalities start coming when we use a lot of these inputs. And so it's worth thinking about, and that's why I think it's really important to work with the product chain in order to make it, as we move towards supermarkets and packaging, as opposed to just selling in open markets where you can't differentiate between the origin of the products. I think that's where you get the opportunity to have people get this sovereignty to make this decision.
I mean, so I don't know a lot about fertilizers, so I don't even know if they're healthy fertilizers.
Yes, actually, yeah.
But I mean, is there a way for us to not have to go to the route of making something unhealthy and still staying, I mean, that's one thing I'm super proud of with Africa. Like, we are organic, and pretty much everything we eat at home is naturally grown. Yeah. And how do we maintain that while growing?
Yeah, although be really careful about vegetables, which in urban areas are produced almost exclusively with organic human waste as fertilizer. And so, in fact, even though there's really health issues that are much, I think, of a higher order of importance than the effects of chemicals. Now, on the other hand, so let me separate two things. One thing is pesticides and weedicides, which really do have direct effects on human health when they're ingested. Fertilizer is much less of an issue. What it has is environmental effects. The runoff of fertilizer can cause problems in water supply through algae blooms, et cetera. It can really cause environmental havoc. But there's much less evidence that it causes a direct health issue. But pesticides and weedicides really do. And it is an issue because we really have to monitor this. And the first order effects are on the workers on farms. And when you're using unsafe methods of application of pesticides and weedicides, which happens all the time on commercial farms in Africa because there's no enforcement of regulations on workplace health and safety. It's still a second order issue in terms of numbers because there's so few farmers doing this. But you can see it emerging. You need a regulatory environment to watch that. Otherwise, farmers will certainly have workers without gloves and without masks spraying chemicals all over the place. And they're the ones who are really going to suffer first.
Great. Thank you so much.